Good evening. Happy springtime, happy summer, happy drying out. Welcome to the last program of the 29th year of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. Could the World War II veterans in the audience please stand and we could recognize you, please? Thank you. Thank you. Let's get right into our program. This is a program that I've wanted to do for a long time. And as you get older, you forget a few things, and I'll warn some of you folks out there. But there was a gentleman that used to live in western Minnesota. I have forgotten his name. He was in the Minnesota National Guard. He was the motor officer at the Potsdam conference. And he talked to me about it several times. And of course, the Potsdam conference, I think, when Michael starts talking about it, there were a lot of dignitaries and probably a lot of big egos involved in it. But I could never find a speaker, a book, to match up with him. And were there any of you veterans that stood up earlier that were involved in Potsdam? And any of you just, we never know who's going to come in to a program. But this is an important topic. And again, I don't want to steal Michael's thunder. It was kind of a coming together of the victors of World War II in European theater. It was a decision to drop the atomic bomb. And many of you that have followed the news recently have heard about the president visiting the Hiroshima memorial. And it was really kind of the kickoff of the Cold War that many of us labored through. So it is an important topic, and it's one that we need to know more about. I met Dr. Neiberg when my son was at the Army War College last year. And we've been working to try to get him out here, and I'm so thankful that we achieved that goal. Dr. Neiberg's book that Axel showed you was just awarded the Harry S. Truman Award from the Truman Presidential Library, which is no small recognition. He is recently appointed as the chair of war studies at the Army War College. Dr. Neiberg, thank you for coming, and welcome to Minnesota.
My interests in this book were not to tell a story about who said what to whom. My interest in this book was to try to take what happened at this conference and use it as a lens into larger historical patterns, to use it as a way to understand the end of the Second World War, and more importantly, to understand the end of what these guys understood, which was to understand the end of what they conceived as a 30-year period of total war that had begun in 1914. And I'm going to talk about that as I move forward. I also did not want, as many previous histories of this conference had done, to presume that a Cold War was coming. They didn't presume that. They didn't know that. So what I want to do in this brief talk that I'm going to give tonight is to talk about three themes that emerge out of the Potsdam Conference. The first is to understand how the people sitting around this table understood Potsdam. And I've already given you the bottom line up front, the bluff on this one. They did not see Potsdam as the start of a Cold War. They saw Potsdam as a way to finish the job that their predecessors had failed to do in Paris in 1919. Second, I wanted to talk a little bit about whether men really make history, and women, or whether it is the context that makes history. And this is an old question, argued over many history conferences in many bars. Ann O'Hare McCormick, a reporter from the New York Times, went to Europe right before the Potsdam Conference. She described Europe in this time period as she put it, one vast graveyard. So as I was putting this book together, I was thinking, what's more important, the graveyard or the people sent to mind it? And I'll show you some of the photographs here of what Europe looked like in 1945. It involved, of course, millions of refugees, including German refugees. It involved more and more discoveries of the death camps. It involved something called the DP problem, the displaced person problem, that is, people with no home state to go back to. And it involved the nearly complete destruction of Europe's infrastructure. Potsdam is as good a laboratory as an historian could ask for answering this question, because in the middle of this conference, one of the great leaders of the alliance and his advisors, Winston Churchill, will go away. And the United States had just replaced its leader just a couple of weeks, really, earlier, when President Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and a complete neophyte to the international order, Harry Truman, had become president of the United States. Truman had, before he became president, never met a Russian. He had not left the United States since returning from the Western Front in 1919. He had no experience in foreign affairs, and remarkably to me, had no education past high school. Yet he's the President of the United States. His Secretary of State, James Burns, newly appointed, also had no education beyond high school. Third, we all have a vision in our heads of history, whether we think about it or not. And those students who are here, it's worth starting to think about this. Everybody has a vision in their head of how we got to where we got. It might be influenced by entertainment and Hollywood. It might be influenced by history. It might be influenced by a deep study of history. Or it might be none of those things. We all have it, though. And I was interested, as I'll talk here, in the way that the sense of history that people had in 1945 conditioned the way they thought about the present and conditioned the way they thought about the future as well. So let me set the stage. This is Berlin, and I know many of you have been there. This is just off the Unter der Linden, the main street that goes through Berlin. This is near the Adlon Hotel, now one of the luxury five-star hotels in Berlin, and it was in the 1930s as well. Look at the condition that Berlin is in 1945. This is the graveyard that Anne Marie McCormick described. Just today, I was in the wonderful Russian Museum of Russian Art here in Minneapolis, which Don was kind enough to take me to. And there is a painting on the wall there I would recommend that everybody see before this exhibit goes away. It is by the Soviet artist Pavel Sokolov-Sakaya, and it is called Berlin Concert in a Defeated Berlin. And it shows 3 Russian officers listening to music being played by either German or Russian musicians, it's not clear, being played by candlelight, because of course Berlin has no electricity. And behind them, looking through the window, you can see the devastation of the city of Berlin. And what struck me most about this painting, American images of the end of World War II, we think of things like that soldier kissing the woman in Times Square, right? In this image, the 3 Russian officers are not smiling. They have a somber, really terrified look on their face because they're looking at this. Now, the Russians wanted to be absolutely sure that American and British officers saw this with their own eyes. The Russians knew that in 1919, when the Americans came to negotiate what became the Treaty of Versailles, President Woodrow Wilson refused to leave Paris, refused to go and see the Western Front, no matter how hard the French tried to take him. The French wanted him to see what the Germans had done so that he would understand, he would understand why they were demanding the kind of peace that they were demanding. The Russians wanted to make sure that would not happen again. And I can talk a little more about this if you want. The same basic questions about Berlin from 1919 were there again in 1945. What should the great powers do with Germany? Should they rebuild it? That is, should they put their own limited resources into this country in an attempt to build it back up? Should they destroy it? The outgoing American Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, proposed doing just that. He proposed breaking Germany into its old borders, its 1648 borders, or at the very least creating in the new Germany 7 different states, and then taking away all of its industry forever. At one point in 1943, that became American and British policy, by the way. By 1945, the British had concluded that that was a really bad idea because then German customers wouldn't be able to buy British products. The great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who was at both peace conferences, 1919 and 1945, said that if you did the so-called Morgenthau Plan, you would guarantee a third world war. But if you put money in to Germany, does that mean that the Germans will live better than the Russians after the war? Does it mean they'll live better than the refugees? Does it mean they'll live better than the camp survivors? Does it mean they'll live better than the French, than the Poles? It's not an easy question to answer. What caused these wars? There were some who argued that the fundamental problem was the Germans. There was something fundamentally wrong with them. There were American psychologists who went to Germany to study German psychology to figure out what was wrong with them. The State Department had the great idea of sending a bunch of American movies to Germany and forced the Germans to watch them, hoping this would turn them into individualists. So they sent them cowboy movies. Okay? This is a true story. A close friend of mine from high school wrote a book on this. The German reaction to watching cowboy movies was to turn to their American State Department officials and say, if you were allowed to kill your Indians, why are you mad at us for killing the Jews? So the State Department had to find another approach. A second argument said that there was nothing wrong with the German people themselves. What you had to do was give them a democratic government. Where you had failed before was by creating a weak government that didn't represent the German people, the Weimar Republic of 1919, which could then be overturned by the Nazis in 1933. Another argument said there was nothing wrong necessarily with the Germans, but it was going to take generations to wipe out the mentality that had been drummed into them in the 1930s and early 1940s. That argument implied that the Americans, the Russians, the British, the French, somebody was going to have to occupy the country until those generations went away. And until you answer that question of what caused this war, and by extension what caused both world wars, you can't really begin to solve the problem. Until you diagnose the disease, in effect, you can't recommend a prescription. What you have to do is make absolutely sure in 1945 that the Germans know they have been beaten. What you must do, everybody agreed, about the only thing everybody agreed on, was make sure that the German people understood the magnitude of their defeat. And the Russians were going to do this two ways. One, by showing them images of Berlin like this one, and the other was by constant occupation, making sure that the Germans saw with their own eyes that outsiders now controlled their fate. The Americans did this in a slightly different way, as some of you may know, marching Germans through concentration camps, forcing German citizens to take care of concentration camp survivors, constantly reminding the Germans of their defeat in every way that they could. And as I mentioned outside in the group I was talking to earlier, everybody had their antenna up, looking for signs of how the German people were going to react to their defeat this time. Truman's bodyguard, who had 4 German-born grandparents and spoke fluent German, wandered around Germany, eavesdropping and listening in. And he wrote a report in which he said, I hear people are upset that they lost the war. I don't hear any remorse. I don't hear any acceptance of guilt, any acceptance of blame. And until we do, we have to be very careful. We can't afford to do this a third time. The fundamental question is exactly the same as it was in 1919. What caused these wars? And what can we do to make sure that another one doesn't happen? So how to treat that? Well, what I did is I borrowed off of a book by an Oxford political scientist named Yuen Foong Kong, a Hong Kong-born British political scientist at Oxford, who wrote a fascinating book called Analogies at War, in which he argued, he took the case study of the American decision to send ground troops into Vietnam in 1965. And he said the single most important determination of how a person advised President Johnson in 1965 was what historical analogy he, in this case they were all men, he made. If they thought that this was another Munich, in other words, appeasing the communists if you don't do something, then they argued for sending American ground forces in. If they argued that this was going to be like the Korean War, something that was going to go a long, long way and ultimately prove inconclusive, then they argued for limiting it to a kind of air campaign with some ground support. If the historical analogy they drew was Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat in 1954 in Vietnam, then they tended to argue for not doing anything at all. And he did this study in a very sophisticated manner and even divided it between what they said in public and what they said in private. And he said, the only thing you have to know Doesn't matter what political party they were in, doesn't matter what part of the United States they were in, doesn't matter anything else. All you need to know is what historical analogy they drew. And you'll know what they told Johnson in 1965. So, riffing off of that, it's not too much to argue that one's version of history is a major factor in determining one's view of current day policy. What's the dominant analogy? And there were at least 4 that were discussed at Potsdam, one of which dominates the others, and I'll save that one for last. The first is Munich. And this is the picture that I have up here on the top right, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain shaking hands with Adolf Hitler shortly before the famous Munich conference in which the British gave away most of Czechoslovakia. Some Brits and some Americans saw the Soviet Union as being the new Germany. If we don't stand up to them here at Potsdam, they're going to do what the Germans did. They're going to be the next great threat, and we need to appease them. Not everybody agreed. Harry Truman did not agree. And the man who I think got it right, the man who came closest to getting it right, the American charge d'affaires in Moscow, a very well-known guy by the name of George Kennan, Kennan also argued against seeing it this way. And I can talk more about Kennan if you like. I just got the privilege 2 days ago of sitting at his desk at the National Defense University, where he was president for a while. Another analogy was the post-war financial arrangements that came out of the Versailles Peace Treaty and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference. The argument that came out of this was that what the United States had done through the Dawes Plan and Young Plan, for those of you that are into this stuff, gave money to the Germans. That money was then supposed to go to pay off the reparations that they owed to the British and French, who would then pay off the debt they owed to American banks. What ended up happening, as James Burns, the American Secretary of State, especially argued, is that the United States ended up giving money to Germany, who ended up not giving very much to France, who ended up not paying very much back to us. Okay? This is what Herbert Hoover believed had caused the Great Depression, the failure of American financial policy to fix the economy of Europe. A third analogy was the analogy of Alsace and Lorraine, the 2 provinces the Germans took away from the French in 1870, 1871. Now, historically, I think there's no reason for this to have been an analogy, but it was one. In other words, what you don't want to do is take territory away from a country that's going to want to fight another war to get it back. Okay? The fourth one, and the one that is the most prominent and mentioned the most often, is the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And it's always mentioned negatively. Whatever we do, don't make the mistake they made in 1919. This is what they did in 1919. These 3 men, for the most part, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, he's the man pointing his cane there, the French Prime Minister, and the American President Woodrow Wilson, invited everybody who thought they had a stake in this, except for the Germans and the Russians, to come to Paris and plead their case. Then they literally took enormous maps of Europe and crayons and drew the new boundaries of Europe. What they created was a group of states that did not represent the ethnicities of their people, were strategically unviable, that is, created borders they could not defend, and in many cases economically unviable as well. That's one thing they're sure they don't want to do. And I have to stress this again. The Treaty of Versailles was not ancient history to these people. James Burns was there as an advisor to President Wilson. John Maynard Keynes was at both conferences. Winston Churchill was at both conferences. These were things they remembered. The very first document I saw when I started doing research on this project was in the British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden's papers at the University of Birmingham in England. The very first paper, the very first document in the Potsdam collection that they have of his is an assessment he ordered the Foreign Office historians to write in 1943, when the war's outcome was still very much in doubt, about what had gone wrong at Versailles. What had they done wrong? What mistakes do I need not to make next time? What were those mistakes? Most people agreed on at least 3. 1, charging the Germans reparations far in excess of what they could pay created a cycle of problems that you were never going to get out of. Reparations solved the political problem, that is, it allowed politicians to say we were tough with the Germans, but it made the economic problems even worse, something John Maynard Keynes himself deeply believed, and some of you know, he left the Paris Peace Conference in the middle of it when he realized what the reparations thing was going to do, went back to England and wrote the best-selling book of 1920, a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. William Bullitt, the American advisor, who later became an American ambassador to the Soviet Union, resigned from the conference at about the same time, handed in his resignation letter, which said, "I'm going down to the south of France to sit in the sun and watch the world go to hell." That's not a good note to send to your boss. The second mistake that they made, most people believed, was by moving countries by redrawing borders. In other words, simply putting lines on a map doesn't solve the fundamental problem. What you did, of course, was create areas on this map where there were Poles living next to Ukrainians. Look what they did with Yugoslavia, creating one country out of a group of people that fundamentally do not like each other. Putting Germans inside the Polish border, Poles inside the German border, etc., etc., etc. And third, the argument went, by allowing everybody to come to Versailles and pitch their case and plead their case, you created situations you had to resolve that had nothing to do with you. So that the big three here in the bottom left-hand corner ended up arguing over and debating over and deciding over places they had never heard of. One of those places, which they certainly had heard of, was the Shandong Peninsula in China, which had belonged to Germany before World War I. Japan took it during World War I. China wanted it back. In the end, the United States gave it to Japan, causing most senior officials at the conference to react with fury. Tasker Bliss, the man for whom I want to name the chair that I was just blessed with being given, Tasker Bliss considered resigning his commission over the Shandong decision. In 1945, you'll note, they're not going to do anything of the sort, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. And again, with the exception of the atomic bomb, which Harry Truman finds out about its success in the middle of the conference, every single issue they dealt with in 1945, they dealt with in 1919. And again, they all knew it. They knew they were coming back to the same problems. What to do with Germany? Reconstruct it or take reparations out of it? How to handle the ethnic map of Europe? What to do with this? What role should the United States play in a post-war Europe? Remember, at this point, the war with Japan is not over. What role should multilateral organizations play? Things like the United Nations, which I'll talk about in just a bit. Above all, what they argued is you cannot screw this up again. If you do, and a third world war happens, then you have a lot on your heads. So, what happens? In 1919, 3 countries are going to run this, and only 3 countries. And they are represented, among other people that are in this picture. The man on the left you all recognize, I hope, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. The man to his left, please notice everybody's smiling in these photographs, right? The tension's not there yet. Even Stalin is smiling. The man to his left in the nice suit, it's a shame that we don't have those kinds of suits anymore, the double-breasted suits. That's a sharp look. That's the American President Harry Truman, who as Captain Harry Truman was a soldier in the First World War. The day the Treaty of Versailles was signed, June 28, 1919, is the day Harry Truman got married. The man to his left is his new Secretary of State. That is James Burns. And the man to his left is the Russian Foreign Minister Molotov, nicknamed Stone Ass for his ability to stare at someone with no expression on his face at all for as long as necessary to get the subject changed. These 3 countries, Great Britain's involved too. I'll talk about the Brits in just a bit. I didn't leave them out on purpose here. These 3 countries will run this conference. Nobody else is going to come. Nobody else. The French are not invited, despite believing themselves part of the winning coalition. The Poles are not invited, despite believing the same thing. The British Dominions are not invited. That means Canada's not here, Australia's not here, New Zealand's not here, India's not here. This is important. This is important. The first document Canada ever signed as a sovereign country was the Treaty of Versailles. They're not even invited to come to this one. Right? This one's going to be nice and small. I think it's symbolic that the Soviet Union set the place of where this conference was going to happen. The Russians said they would only go to a place that the Soviet army controlled. They would not leave territory that they had possession over. Stalin also notoriously hated getting into airplanes. Hated airplanes. So it was going to be someplace he could get to by train. The United States tried to offer Washington, D.C., hoping to get Stalin to come and see America with his own eyes. The Russians said no. The United States countered with Alaska, which would have been an interesting place to hold a conference in July. I mean that sincerely. Close to Russia, but American soil. It would have been a very interesting place and would have forced Churchill to make the long voyage, which would have been interesting. The Russians said no to that as well. They decided on Potsdam. You want to have a conference? That's where it's going to be. And Potsdam is a pretty little town I'll talk about in just a bit, just in the southwest suburbs of Berlin. That's the only place. The Soviets take it because it's in the Soviet zone of control. They do security. They control the roads in and out. They ban almost everybody. The Red Army came in and moved out every single German. Harry Truman did not see a single German for the duration of the Potsdam Conference. Neither did almost anybody else. The Soviet Union would be in full control, as I'll show you here in just a bit. And again, I suspect, though I can't prove it, that another reason for the choice of Potsdam was to force the Americans and British to see the devastation of Berlin for themselves. The air routes in and out of Potsdam went through Berlin. That is, the only way they could get there was to land in Berlin and take a caravan through the roads the Soviets had cleared through Berlin. In other words, they could only get to Potsdam by taking the routes the Soviets had opened for them. And I think they did that on purpose. Truman set the timing of the conference. He wanted to wait as long as possible, both to figure out what the heck he was doing as President of the United States, and to give the scientists in New Mexico as long as possible to see if they could get that atomic bomb to work, the famed Trinity test. The only thing Great Britain set was the code name. The code name was Operation Terminal for the end of the war. It's Churchill's own choice. The United Kingdom knew that it was absolutely bankrupt. The United Kingdom had gone to the United States years before, in 1940, before the United States got involved in the war, and brought with them their financial ledgers and told the American government, we're out of money. We have nothing left. As I was mentioning out there, Great Britain's entire sovereign gold supply was moved in 1940 from London to underneath the Federal Reserve Building in New York City, where it still sits today. There is a very famous photograph showing Churchill, Truman, and Stalin sitting on white chairs for the official press photograph. When that picture was being taken, Winston Churchill, every time before the photographer tried to take the picture, Churchill would pick his seat up and move it a little closer to Truman's, hoping to show that the United States and Britain were together. Truman saw that and would pick his chair up and move it a little bit closer into the center. Okay? Churchill talked a lot about Anglo-American ideas, the way we Anglo-Saxons view the world, the Anglo-American strategic vision. And the Americans reminded him again and again and again, there is no Anglo-American strategic vision. We don't see the world the way that you see it. And I'll talk a little more about that. They were at Potsdam to end a war, and the common enemy remained Germany. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of personalities here. This is that same photograph, only without Winston Churchill, as you'll note. Again, historians have this problem when we study history. We cannot go back into history and undie Franklin Roosevelt. We can't go back into history. The question that sometimes Joe Fitzharris is in the back, he'll back me up, I hope. Historians like to ask the dead Hitler baby question. If Adolf Hitler dies in his crib, does the Second World War still happen? It's fun to talk about in a bar. It's impossible to prove because we as historians can't go back and change things. Here at Potsdam, things change. Things change. The man in the middle is a brand new American president, Harry Truman, who is as surprised as anybody else that he ends up on the Democratic ticket in 1944. He is as surprised as anybody else when he finds out that he's going to be president of the United States because Franklin Roosevelt has just died. As sick as Roosevelt was, if the American people, if the Democratic Party thought that Roosevelt was going to die, James Burns, not Harry Truman, would have been the vice president. Truman came into office convinced of two things, I suppose. Well, probably more than two. But two of the most important are that he had to continue the policies of Franklin Roosevelt insofar as he understood them. And two, he had to get rid of all of Roosevelt's advisors, none of whom he trusted. So the first man he turns to is, I think, the most fascinating unknown figure in American history. The only man in the history of this country to serve on the Supreme Court, in the cabinet, in the House, in the Senate, and as governor. And that is South Carolina's James Burns. High school education only. Okay. Burns is an interesting guy about whom we know almost nothing, because it appears his wife didn't like him enough to preserve his legacy, and they never had children. So there is a brand new team that comes to Potsdam, a brand new American advisory team led by Truman and Burns. As I mentioned, in the middle of this conference, the British have an election. Churchill and everybody else presumes there will be a landslide victory for Churchill's Conservative Party. He can go back to the conference in Potsdam after the election break and say, look at this big win. I represent the British people. It's what David Lloyd George had done before the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Instead, to everybody's great surprise, he loses to that man, Clement Attlee, the deputy prime minister during the war, and a man that Churchill described as a sheep in sheep's clothing. And when Attlee came back to Potsdam, one American journalist said the big three have just been replaced by the big 2.5, which is a great line. On the other hand, those of you who know a little bit of your First World War history will know about the Gallipoli operation, the strategic disaster that Winston Churchill put together. This man, Clement Attlee, was the second to last man off those beaches. Clement Attlee had a brigade named after him among the volunteers in the Spanish Civil War fighting fascism. This was a calm, mild-mannered guy who knew what he was doing. To me, what's interesting, despite the change of personalities, and in the British case, despite the change of parties, the bargaining positions of these men do not change at all. And people remarked on it at the time. The fact that Great Britain had no money doesn't change because Clement Attlee replaces Winston Churchill. One of Attlee's advisors, Ernst Bevin, the man who put together the British healthcare system that they still have today, Bevin was obviously going to join the cabinet in some way. He went to Anthony Eden, and Anthony Eden said, what position do you want in the new government? And Bevin said, I want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is their equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury. Eden snapped back at him and said, whatever for? To account for the money we haven't got? And told him to become Foreign Minister, which is the position that he took. Okay. Fascinating little case study. Truman faced the same problem that Franklin Roosevelt faced, which is essentially, what are we doing about the Russians? Who are they? What do they want? How do we read them? And Roosevelt and Truman faced the same problem. They had three very bright advisors who were giving them three very different sets of advice. Robert Lovett, and backed up by the American ambassador in the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, argued for being tough. Argued that this was an ideologically driven regime that was going to try to expand that ideology through a weakened Europe. And Potsdam was a chance to stand up to them. The man on the far right, Charles Chip Bullen, had a different view. He said if you look at what the Soviets say they want and what we think they want the same thing that the Tsar wanted in 1914. They want control over Poland. They want access to a warm water port. They don't want to go into any place where they're not comfortable. What you need to do is recognize that. And then there was George Kennan's longer view. And again, I think Kennan is one of the real bright minds, lived to be about 100, and was involved in a lot of American foreign policy decisions. Kennan, who had lived in Russia, said, look, no Westerner can understand this country. They think differently than us. They act differently from us. They see the world differently from us. World War II, Kennan argued, brought out all of the absolute worst aspects of Russia. It brought out their paranoia. It brought out their fear of invasion. It brought out their fear of the regime collapsing from within because of a revolution. Kennan argued, as early as 1945, wherever the Russians want to go, you cannot stop them. If they want to go into Poland, they're going to go into Poland, because Poland means more to them than it does to you. What you can do is contain them. What you can do is stop them from going anywhere else. And wait a couple of decades. You're going to need patience. And then the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union will cause it to collapse from within. Eventually, it will fall apart. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Almost on Kennan's timetable, which is very interesting. And Axel, you took courses from him, so you can talk more about Kennan. If you want to know more about Kennan, that's the guy to talk to. Okay, this is Potsdam. This is the Sicily-Anhoff Palace, and Alex can also correct my pronunciation, which is a very important and very symbolic place to have this conference. Potsdam represents the old German aristocracy. It's where the German kings and princes lived. They didn't live in Berlin, they lived in Potsdam. One of the palaces of Potsdam, not this one, is where the Kaiser signed the declaration of war in 1914. Potsdam also became home in the Nazi era to the German film industry. It became synonymous with movies like Hollywood is in the United States. And some of the best parties thrown at Potsdam by the winning delegations were held at the movie studios. So it represented both the old aristocracy and it represented a kind of a new aristocracy. This building, the Sicilienhof Palace, was built during the First World War in anticipation of having something to celebrate and to be given to the Kaiser's son and named for his wife Cecil. Cecile in German? Cecile in German. Cecile in German. So it has a nice symbolism. It's where the Prussian aristocracy began, that being Potsdam. It's where the Nazi elite lived, and it's where you can put an end to this once and for all. And as you'll see here, the Russians put their stamp on it. When the British and the French, the British and the Americans showed up for the conference, this is what they saw when they drove up. A giant star of red geraniums. The only color of draperies and curtains inside the palace was red. The tablecloths were all red. This is not by coincidence. The Russians also went through all the houses of Potsdam, as I said, kicked the Germans out, took the very best pieces regardless of style, and put them into the homes that the delegates were going to stay in. So Anthony Eden, who was very much an aristocrat, referred to this building with its eclectic, weird stylings in it, and described it as stock exchange Gothic, which, if you know much about British stuff, is a real put-down. The Russians controlled security in and out. There were about 1,000 Russian security guards on point at any one moment here in this conference. No journalists allowed anywhere near the place, but anything that these guys wanted, they got. So I was telling the story earlier, Truman was a piano player, very well-known, very good piano player. He didn't like the sheet music that they had available at Potsdam. He sent a C-47 to Paris to get sheet music. Anthony Eden was suffering from ulcers. He didn't like the milk in Germany. They sent for milk in England. Churchill didn't like the hams the Germans were serving. So they went to Yorkshire to get hams. This is a conqueror's conference. And everybody remarked, because it's a peacetime conference and a victor's conference, the mood was very good. People were drinking. People were smiling. People were dancing. People were enjoying themselves, especially after Attlee replaced Churchill. Attlee and Truman were both soldiers in the First World War. They knew the same body soldier songs and played them on the piano together. All right, I want to focus on the United States in the time I have left and then leave some time for questions and answer. This is Harry Truman taking the oath of office. I find this a startling picture for many reasons. One, of course, is that everybody's dressed in black and nobody's smiling. Nobody's smiling. The other reason is that Harry Truman had chosen this room to take the oath of office. Notice that he's underneath the portrait of Woodrow Wilson. Okay? Truman did not want the ideals of 1919 to go away. That is, he still believed that the expansion of democracy, the expansion of capitalism, the expansion of global markets was the solution. What he didn't believe was that Wilson going and telling the Europeans this was the way to do it. Once he got his feet underneath him, what Truman determined was that he was going to go to Potsdam with cards in his pocket to play. Truman was a great poker player. Roosevelt played bridge, and a few observers remarked on that. The Roosevelts were wine and bridge people. Truman was bourbon and poker. Truman decided he was going to do some things differently than Wilson done. Same goals, but do it differently. So what did he do? The first thing he did was to go to the United States Senate, of which he had just recently been a member, of course. You can imagine the sympathy going out towards Truman taking over this job. Roosevelt has just died. Everybody knows Truman doesn't have a clue what he's doing. Even his closest advisors didn't much have any faith in him. He doesn't know what he's doing. He'll figure it out eventually, but how much time do you have to figure it out? Truman went to the Senate. He asked them to give him a couple of cards to play at this conference. One of the things they gave him were new instruments of policy that he could use. The first, before he went to Potsdam, he asked for a positive vote on the formation of the United Nations. And as some of you will remember from the First World War, from your studies of the First World War, the United States and President Wilson insisted on creating a League of Nations and then voted against it so that the United States was not a part of it. President Warren Harding, who replaced President Wilson, refused even to respond to mail inquiries that the League of Nations sent to the United States. He ordered those queries not to be answered. Truman, by contrast, has the UN vote approved before he even leaves. And this is a photograph of them doing the signing. The first meeting notably, of the United Nations, was held in San Francisco in the War Memorial Opera House, one of the most beautiful buildings built to commemorate the First World War. And the United Nations, this time, instead of the organization being in Geneva, Switzerland, very far away, it was going to go on the east side of Manhattan Island in New York City. This was going to be typical of multilateral organizations in the Truman era, like UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Refugee Agency. The United States was going to create international organizations to spread the responsibilities, but because the money and power would come from the United States would have the majority of the power. And that's why the United Nations has those 5 permanent seats in the Security Council. And the United States, of course, has one. Truman also got approval before he left for something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. This is John Maynard Keynes in the middle right there, that famous British economist who had been at the Paris Peace Conference. Bretton Woods set up the World Bank. It set up the International Monetary Fund. It set up the gold standard as the backing of the United States currency. And it set up a system of currency exchanges all pegged to the United States dollar. Bretton Woods set up a system where when you traveled, you knew what the exchange rate was going to be on your money. And it was all pegged back to the United States dollar. It guaranteed that New York City would be the capital of global finance for as long as you could see into the future. John Maynard Keynes in the middle here said it was a swindle, something Britain could never accept, but they were going to. And in Keynes's great line, we cannot afford to police half the world while we remain in debt to the other half. The Board of Trustees of the Bank of England said the only thing worse than Bretton Woods would be to lose the war. Nevertheless, all these nations are going to agree to Bretton Woods, even for a time the Soviet Union, although they backed out. The British came back and said, look, we know we're broke, we know we're out of soldiers, we know we're done, but you should recognize the contributions that we made to this war, all the sacrifices we made. It is the exact same argument France made in 1919, and Britain rejected it. In this case, it's Britain making the argument to the United States, and the United States rejecting it. The other thing that Bretton Woods did is it guaranteed that American firms, like Minneapolis flour firms, could trade inside the British Empire without paying taxes and tariffs to the British. It meant that if a company in Singapore was going to trade with a company in India, 2 parts of the British Empire, the odds were excellent that that trade would be done in American dollars. Right? It's the reason why New York City became what it is now. Right? Anything that's bought almost anywhere in the world, a cut of that money comes to New York City. Right? Which explains why housing and everything else costs what it does in that city. I'm going next week. It explains why I can't get a hotel room below $350. Right? There's a reason for it, despite the fact that they keep building hotels. I was going to make another comment, but I'll leave it alone. It's a hockey comment. Penguins beat the Rangers. There it is. All right. And I was in New York for that one, too. Okay. The last card, of course, that Harry Truman was able to bring to Potsdam was the knowledge that the Manhattan Project, the project co-run by the Americans, British, and Canadians, but dominated by the Americans, to build an atomic bomb, had worked. Truman got the note at the conference that this had worked. And you can see it in the book, the actual text they use. It's the most transparent code you'll ever see. Right? It's perfectly obvious to anybody that had access to that note something really big had happened, and it was probably a bomb. They didn't do a very good job of this. Harry Truman, as senator, had discovered a $2 billion hole in the federal budget. He went to the Department of War and said, what is this hole in the budget? Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, said, Mr. Truman, there are some things I cannot tell even a senator. I'm not going to tell you. Then he wrote in his private diary, I don't trust that man. Okay. 1945, Truman becomes President of the United States. Stimson, still Secretary of War, has to pull him into a side room and say, Mr. President, I can now tell you what that $2 billion was for. Okay. Harry Truman becomes president, not knowing about the atomic bomb and having no idea where the official records of the Yalta Conference are. Think about that. Truman and Churchill decided that what they would do is tell Stalin about the atomic bomb in as calm a way as possible and avoid the word atomic. Okay, we know now, what they didn't know then, that the Soviet Union had spies in New Mexico and knew all about this. Right? We also know that Truman picked the time to do this shortly after a rather intense conversation about Poland. Stalin, in his mind, linked the two. And he used the word blackmail to describe what he thought Truman was trying to do. The atomic bomb is actually dropped in Hiroshima while the President and the Secretary of State, James Burns, are on the USS Augusta coming home. They are quite literally in the middle of the ocean when it happens. Burns later said, this is the event that marks the start of the Cold War, the use of the atomic bomb. Burns' personal assistant also said as soon as they got the news, the phrase he used was, I watched Burns and Truman hit the bourbon bottle very hard. What he doesn't say is whether they're doing that in celebration, in remorse, in sadness, in fear. That's left unsaid, which is really unfortunate. So let me focus on three things, and then I'll start to wrap up. And then I will wrap up. The first is some of the things that come out of 1919. One of them, of course, is the new borders. In 1945, unlike 1919, to avoid the mistake of 1919, what the great powers are going to do is move people and borders. That is to say, if you are Polish, you now will live inside the borders of the new Poland. If you are German, you will now live inside the borders of the new Germany. The United States and the British knew that the Soviet Union were forcibly moving as many as 35 million people. Okay? You can only do that if you're the Red Army of 1945. And you can imagine, there were plenty of Germans happy to run away from the Red Army in order to get away from this. It's an issue we were talking about a little bit at lunch. The Americans and British knew what was going on and looked the other way. Why? Because as awful a humanitarian problem as it was creating, it was solving the 1919 problem. By the time this process was done, there would be an ethnically homogeneous Poland, an ethnically homogeneous Germany, an ethnically homogeneous Czechoslovakia. You would solve the problem. Poland, of course, paid the price, but as I said in the Q&A a little bit earlier, if it was a casus belli, if it was a reason to go to war for the states of 1939, it was not won by 1945. This was the message Kennan was telling Truman. If you push on Poland, which is a peripheral interest to the United States, expect the Soviet Union to push back 20 times as hard because it's an existential interest to them. Second, the division of Germany. It was done initially to solve the reparations problem. What Burns was most afraid of is that if you created a joint commission on reparations, as they did in 1919, the Soviets were going to take everything they could out of Germany and put them, as Stalin said, on the verge of starvation. And again, you could see it at Potsdam. Any building the Russians occupied, they took everything. They took light fixtures. They took the wooden supports, the wooden slats, inside buildings. They took everything. If they do that on a massive scale in Germany, they will enrich themselves, and the Americans and British will have no choice but to put their resources into Germany or watch the Germans starve to death. And another 1919 specter appeared. Some of you may know the poor public health conditions of the end of the First World War created an influenza epidemic. We still don't know how many million people it killed. If you do that again at the end of the Second World War, you run right back into the same problem. So Burns' solution was to split the country into two. Let the Russians take their reparations in the East in kind, which means rather than demanding money over a 40 or 50-year period, just take what you're going to take. Take railroads, take factories, take laboratories, take what you're going to take. In the West, the United States, France, and Britain opted not to take reparations. Instead, they opted on a program of constructive recovery based on some very strenuous conditions, one of which led to the creation of the European Union, which created the thing that the young students in the room, when you go to Europe and you drive from France to Germany, you're going to see that there's nobody guarding it. It's like going from Iowa to Minnesota. This is historically something pretty weird. An historian of France like I am finds it really odd. There should be somebody guarding that border. Right? There isn't. One reason is, there's a lot of reasons, the 1945 agreements that come out of this insist that Germany and France begin to unite their economies together in what's known as the European Coal and Steel Community. And coal is the important thing because coal was the big thing they fought over in 1919. So Germany was divided for the purposes of reparations, but nobody intended for it to be divided for 50 years, for it to become two separate states. That was not the vision. And third, and the point that I want to finish with, these decisions in 1945 made the men at Potsdam optimistic. They left believing that they had solved the problem of Germany, and they left believing that they had done what they came there to do, which was not to repeat the mistake of 1919, as they understood those mistakes. And that, in my view, is the key to understanding this moment of Potsdam. Potsdam represents to me the final paragraph of the chapter of European history that began on a street corner in Sarajevo in the fateful year of 1914. In the new chapter of that ongoing story, Berlin, Poland, Yugoslavia appear less as actors in their own right than as pawns of a new superpower rivalry. If the men who met at Potsdam in the summer of 1945 could not predict that future, they at least knew the past that they were trying desperately hard not to repeat. Thank you.
Expanding the scope of what you showed, there was something called Sykes-Picot.
1916. That's 1916. That's the other World War, or the first half of this World War.
But I'm talking about how it projected into what's happening today in the Middle East.
1916, the French, British, and then the Russians back out, wrote this secret document called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which took the old Ottoman Empire, the old Middle East, and broke it between the French and British. They shared it. It's why Syria is where Syria is. It's why Iraq has the borders that it has. And it left Palestine in a very ambiguous status that was neither British nor French. So what ISIS is actually doing today, or Daesh, or whatever one wants to call them, they are literally taking bulldozers and driving bulldozers over the Sykes-Picot line to say it's the West that put these borders in. We think they're illegitimate. We're ripping them up. And again, it's a vision of history that the problems of the Middle East are the fault of the Europeans. The fault of the Middle East is the fault of the British and French, and then by extension, the Americans. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
History never ends.
It never ends. You want a new idea, read an old book. It never ends.
Questions?
Your thesis is that Potsdam was not the beginning of the Cold War. At what point would you say that the Cold War began, that the old Allies broke apart?
So I think two things are happening. One, the atomic bomb clearly changes the tenor, and the Americans knew it. By the time they got back to Washington, could read the message traffic coming from the Soviet Union back to the United States, they could see what was going on. The Soviets read it as, we now control Asia, we now control what we want to control, and all the plans we made, because at Potsdam, the Soviets agreed to invade either Japan or northern China. They went into China anyway, which is a part of the story that I didn't tell here. I didn't mention Asia here at all, though I could have, but it's a different lecture and a more complicated story. That deal was out the window, and that the Americans had replaced it by exclusive control. So the Soviets feel that they've been cheated. The other thing I think that becomes really important probably doesn't happen until 1947, when the United States changes its mind and decides that there will be an American physical presence in Europe. Because in 45 and 46, and even well into 1947, the plan is not to stage American troops on the European continent. And by 1947, that plan has changed. So I think it's those two things. Once the United States puts troops in Europe, then the Soviets feel, okay, there's only one reason why they're doing that, and it's to put pressure on us. And the Soviets, of course, are not blameless at all in the way that they treat the countries that they occupy. But I think it's 2 years later. I really do.
Sneaking into Asia just for a minute, and Versailles, most Americans don't know anything about the Chinese involvement in World War I and the extra fury they felt having that province given to Japan. They had great losses in World War I.
Yep, China did not declare war in World War I, though they did send a couple 100,000 Chinese laborers to the Western Front to help France, to free more French soldiers up. When I was in Beijing a few years ago, there is a monument there to something called the May 4th movement. May 4th, 1919 is the day that the Chinese found out that the Shandong Peninsula was going to go to Japan. And it created a series of riots all up and down eastern China. In Paris, what it did, Chinese students living in Paris surrounded the hotel the Chinese delegation was staying in and would not let them leave to sign the Treaty of Versailles. So China never did sign the Treaty of Versailles because the protesters would not let the delegation out of the hotel. The reason there's a monument in Tiananmen Square to this is the Chinese believe that May 4th is the start of the modern Chinese sense of nationalism. So it's enormously important. In World War II, it's the same diplomat, Wellington Koo, for the Chinese, that's doing the negotiation with the US in both cases. In World War II, Wellington Koo is absolutely convinced the Americans are going to sell China out again. So, I mean, these things it's a direct line, A to B, from what happened in World War I to what happened in World War II. China's experience of World War I is one of being betrayed by everybody. And that's the sense that they certainly have of it. It's not pity at all. Dislike de Gaulle, though they did, they recognized in 1944-45, I also wrote a book on the liberation of Paris during World War II, so, and I came to have a great deal of admiration. I think if I were French, I would want everything in France named after Charles de Gaulle too. If I were American or British, I would have wanted him arrested and sent to a jail. I mean, I get it. But what they are aware of, among anything else, is two things. One, de Gaulle in 1945 is a provisional leader of France. He hasn't been elected to anything. So it's likely he's going to go away. Now, in the end, of course, that doesn't happen. The second thing is that no peace settlement in Europe will long exist unless France is willing to accept part of it. And you want, again, this idea of the Cold War starting a little bit later. If you're the United States, you want France to pay part of the cost of this because it will reduce your own costs. So there are reasons to bring France into the tent rather than out of the tent. The interesting thing is what you do about Italy. So if you treat Italy like a conquered country, how should you treat France? If you treat France as a liberated country, how should you treat Italy? Are they the same thing? What de Gaulle did, and the thing that I came to really admire him for, de Gaulle is the guy who says, look, I don't care if you like me or if you don't like me. It's obvious the French people want me as their leader. I'm reflecting the will of the French people. You will not treat us like a conquered people. So de Gaulle found out that the United States was planning to introduce military scrip as the currency of France. That is, the United States military was going to run the economy of France. And de Gaulle said, absolutely not. There's no, this is our country. We will print French francs. The Third Republic will come back, and we'll do it. And he won that argument. So again, if I'm Roosevelt or if I'm Churchill, I get it. And Churchill said, I would like to see him go to Algeria in chains. But if I'm French, name everything after him. Name everything after him. For what he did in World War II and what he did after too. Right? Which is another history. De Gaulle, by the way, is the man to connect these two. De Gaulle is the man who went to China and said, China is a very large country inhabited by many Chinese.
Thank you. Bill O'Reilly, in his book, Killing Patton, states that Joseph Stalin, in addition to speaking Georgian, his native language, and Russian, as a third language, he knew some English, but he kept it a secret in all these conferences.
No.
So that when,
No.
well, let me finish. So that when Truman and Churchill talked English among themselves, he sat by and took it all in. That's what Bill O'Reilly states. You disagree?
How would I put this gently? Bill O'Reilly is not a credible source when it comes to history. Next question. Maybe it's a professional bias on my part, but the people that should be writing history are historians who look at the sources, who are trained in it, who do it for a living, not journalists. With a couple of exceptions. Rick Atkinson's fantastic. Let me get that on the record in case he watches this on YouTube. Rick, I love you. Okay.
At the end of the Potsdam Conference, in regards to Russian declaration of war or somehow entering into the Asian sphere, was there plans for Russia to either jointly occupy Japan, or was it help us declare war and then we're going to take it all since we were the sole force of occupation?
The big problem is less Japan than it is mainland China. So if the United States gets Japan to surrender, say, but the million or so Japanese soldiers in China don't obey the surrender, there's nothing the United States can do about that. There's a lot the Russians can do about it. So the agreement was, and the Russians did it, they invade Manchuria in an operation called Red Storm that is probably the largest military operation that no one's ever heard of. It's millions of Russian soldiers going in. And they take control of most of Manchuria. That's what the deal is, that the Soviets will put pressure on those million Japanese soldiers. Otherwise, there's no way to get them out of China. And just to put a little footnote on this, in the early 1930s, the Japanese Kwangdong Army, which was operating in northern China, more or less operated independently, disregarding the things coming from Tokyo. The fear is they're going to do that again. Does that make sense? Yeah. So even if you get the Japanese government to say, we're done here, it doesn't mean those million Japanese will do that. And the Chinese army's not going to do it, and the American army's not going to do it. The only people who can force that are the Red Army. Mm-hmm.
How has the new president, Truman, really performed at Potsdam?
I have to say, I came to have just tremendous respect for what Truman did. And I think two things he did that were really important. He listened to the people who were around him, but he also learned how to figure out how to deal with competing advice. So the one person he seems to have listened to without ever questioning him was George Marshall. He was enthralled by Marshall, as many people were. Everybody else he asked pretty hard questions to. Well, why are you presuming that A will lead to B? Why do you think that this will do that? Why is what Harriman telling me different from what you're telling me? And I think he, you know, what they say about football players, if you put the second string quarterback in, you simplify the game plan. So what Truman did is he said, look, there are three things I want to get out of this conference. Once I get those three things, we're done. He got them, we're done. But I came to have tremendous respect, so I'm deeply honored that I'm going to go out to the Truman Library in July and accept this award. I came to have a lot of respect for Truman and a lot less for Churchill.
I like your thesis, your focus on World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. That's very convincing. But on the other hand, there was an understanding of some sort that Truman had about Stalin from listening to Patterson and from listening to Kennan and Bolin. Harriman also talked with him, and there was not a great deal of trust.
No.
Toward the Soviet Union.
No.
At Potsdam, and so by carefully isolating yourself from the beginning of the Cold War here, you haven't told us the sense in which there was, in fact, this distrust.
Well, I mean, we should be clear. We should be clear. The Americans were less worried about whether they could trust Stalin, although they thought they could by the time at the end of Potsdam. What they were trying to gauge was whether American interests and Russian interests would come into conflict or not. That's not quite the same thing as trust. So as James Burns himself said, you know, Burns went to Potsdam saying, look, I'm going to treat him like I treat everybody else in the Senate. If he wants a post office built in his town, we'll build one in my town. And by the end of the conference, Burns is saying, look, I don't know if I can trust him or not. It doesn't matter. Our interests and their interests don't necessarily conflict. We can do business. Whether we like each other or not, whether we trust each other or not, that doesn't matter. It's not George W. Bush looking and saying, I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw the man's soul. That's not what Burns is doing. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I'm just making the comparison, right? What Burns did, and Truman did, is to say, look, I don't believe that our interests and their interests necessarily need to come into conflict. Might they? Yes. But they don't have to.
But basically, you're saying then that the Soviet Union, their actions between 1946 and 1947 were what precipitated the Cold War.
No, I don't think I'm necessarily saying that. There's an old joke, how many historians does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, I don't know, I didn't study that period. So my work stops at 45, so that's not my light bulb. But what I can say with confidence is that when Burns left in 45 and Truman left Potsdam, they left convinced that American interests and Soviet interests could come into conflict, but they didn't necessarily have to come into conflict. American and British interests would come into conflict, though you'd be able to manage that because American power was so much greater than British power.
That's interesting because that coincides then with Eisenhower's capacity to get along with Zhukov during this time
Of course.
period.
I mean, the American senior officers and Soviet senior officers get along unbelievably well in 1945. Yeah. They get along incredibly well.
I think that's very encouraging.
Right?
Thank you.
I mean, I think it's encouraging as well, and I think it's, you know, it also, remember, one of the reasons the Cold War didn't go hot, well, maybe, again, it's not my light bulb, maybe I should shut up here, but you know, the United States and Soviet Union maintained contact throughout the whole thing. Right? That's important.
One thing that I recall, Germany was divided into the British, the U.S., and the Russian.
French.
And the Russian.
Yeah.
And de Gaulle said, I want part of it. And I think, wasn't there some comment that said that you'll have to give it out of what you've
Out of the
already
American
got?
zone, right.
Out of the American zone.
Right, so
And that's that blue part.
This blue part right here is the French zone. It's carved out of the American zone. So essentially what the Russians, and they're quite frank about this. You know, there was an Italian unit that served on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians, and the French had a fascist government during the war. They had Pétain's État Français fighting against them. The Russian position was clear. Anybody that did that gets nothing. Right? The American and British position is if we're going to rebuild Europe, France has to be part of it. There's no other way around it. And I think the American position on that one was right. There's no other way around it. You can't have a Europe without a functioning France and a functioning Germany. You can't. You can't. And they need to get along, which is, again, the remarkable thing to me about looking at Europe today, that France and Germany have done this. They've managed to do it. Right? It's incredible. Historically, it's incredible.
Well, listen, I see no more hands. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
Wonderful job.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.